So my goal for today is really to give you the vocabulary and a certain framework that I think is useful for really being able to answer this question about how to think about fairness in a nuanced manner. And so rather than kind of go back through some thoughts that may have come up, what I would say is hold on to the things that you just mentioned, and as we go through the slides, I'm sure these things are going to become salient again. So let's get into them then in context of particulars. Okay. So first point, this is not just about testing, right? What I think about is I think about the measurement of psychological variables. And that's a very useful way of thinking about things rather than just testing, because if you're asked to measure financial literacy in college students, assess an individual's comfort in an online or digital learning environment, design a survey of voter engagement, right? All of these things.
I gave him a clue about what your project
All of these issues require the measurement of some psychological variable or another, and so I think that the same concerns that one has about test fairness are going to be germane to these issues as well. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the motivating analogy for me is the idea of measurement. So psychological measurement is an attempt to measure some particular latent psychological trait, and the basic punchline is that if it doesn't make sense in terms of measuring something with a ruler, then you're probably doing it wrong. And so, there are two kinds of, well, this is just kind of vocabulary. There are two types of psychological variables, right? There are kind of cognitive psychological variables, and we tend to call those measurement instrument tests. And then there are attitudinal variables, there are kind of belief-related psychological variables. Those things are called surveys, but the framework I'm going to set up really is relevant to all of these things. So in terms of fairness, the basic issue to me is whether the error in the measurement process is associated with other characteristics. And now I'm going to go back to my ruler example. If I want to learn something about the height of a person, my measure of their height should never depend upon other irrelevant attributes of that individual, right? How tall my measurement process states that you are should not depend upon how much you weigh, upon your shoes, right? Are you wearing flip-flops or high heels? It shouldn't depend upon your hairstyle, right? Those are all irrelevant variables from the perspective of my measurement process. And if my measurement process is really picking up these other things, then it's not really clear what I'm measuring. And so this is, I think, if you're ever are in doubt about how this, about how something in the realm of psychological measurement should work, something like this, I think, is a good bedrock principle to go back to. Okay, so a little more vocabulary before we start to get into the nitty-gritty. So in examining fairness, we'll typically identify a reference group and a focal group. In the earlier slide with the GRE, the reference group was whites or Asian Americans. The focal group was African Americans. That was the group that the authors were most concerned about. And the question is typically whether the measurement process is invariant across these two groups. And by invariant, I just mean has the same properties. This, I think, is just an unbelievably useful set of vocabulary terms. The first term is impact. So a measurement process is said to have impact if students in group 1, the reference group, tend to do better on a test than students in group 2. That's known as impact. Bias is something else. Bias is the following. Students in group 1 tend to do better on a test than students in group 2 for reasons unrelated to the underlying attribute of interest, right? This distinction is just incredibly important because it is absolutely the case that the existence of impact does not mean a measurement process is biased. If I told you that in the world, men are taller on average than women, and your claim to me was that means that rulers are biased, I don't find that incredibly persuasive, right? This is just an example of impact. And so anytime somebody points to anytime somebody just points to a difference between groups, they've identified impact. That does not make it biased, right? This requires additional evidence. Yeah?
Are there examples of impact in academic settings? Because I get your point about, an actual physical characteristic, men are taller than women on average, but when we get into sort of these like motivational or educational issues,
Well, see,
Does
I-
that start to bleed more into the realm of bias because of a lot of things that
So I
talk
think
about a lot here?
what gets challenging is that since we can't ever actually, I can unobjectively put two people up next to one another and say person X is taller than person Y. I can't ever actually get my hands on somebody's brain and say person X knows more than person Y. And so essentially you have a situation where one person's impact could be another person's bias. And I think, I'll show some examples later, but to me, it really just comes down to what evidence do you have about the measurement process, what went into the design of the measurement process. Things like that are how I would kind of dispute claims about whether something is impacted by it. Any other questions about this point? So an example from the political realm, most surveys in the U.S. would identify women as being more liberal than men on some kind of liberal conservative scale. And that I think is a good example of what I would call impact, but again, what I would call impact, some others might view as bias. So I think with all psychological variables, this is true. Okay, so now let's talk about reasons for bias. So one bias is just construct bias, right? And what happens here is if we just have an inconsistent meaning or relevance of a construct across groups. So one example of this might be the word liberal, right? If I want to determine, something about liberalism in the U.S., I had better be very careful, before trying to do the same thing in Europe, because liberalism means something very different there, right? So if things don't have consistent meanings across context, that's going to really wreak havoc with the measurement process. Another way you could think about this is over time, the relevant skills for being an attorney, for example, may have changed between 1960 and 2015, and if that's the case, you would expect the LSAT to have changed to reflect those things, right? So the construct has shifted over time, and so it's just important to always think about how the measurement process it is contingent upon the way you've defined your construct, and you have to ask questions about whether that's a reasonable definition.
You're using a term, construct.
Oh, okay. So
maybe you could just.
So construct is just shorthand for some kind of psychological variable of interest. It could be, how conservative or liberal you are, how much do you know about calculus, how comfortable are you in some online learning environment. Any of those things would be, I could just call them a construct for shorthand. Any other questions? Okay, so yep.
Another point of clarification. So you keep talking about traits or attributes. Do you want to say, does it, for the purposes of what you're discussing, does it matter if the underlying construct is of a fixed trait or a current state?
Oh yeah, so I have to admit, I tend to be a little bit, I don't always use words in the most consistent manner, especially, well, even when writing. You can talk to my dissertation advisor at length about this. But so I'm generally talking about something that is, if not fixed in time, that we're only interested in identifying what it is at a moment in time. We're not interested in the dynamics of the thing. We just want to know kind of where you are at a moment. Yeah.
So for each of these reasons, can you walk us through an actual example? So you mentioned the example of the LSAT and the lawyers. So can you use that in a sentence? So do you mean that the LSAT today is biased towards the skills of the 60s?
Let me give you another example. I'm having a hard time even going for the LSAT. In the U.S., for example, if you want to be an orthopedist, say you want to specialize in certain kinds of reconstructive surgeries, that's going to be the thing that a credentialed doctor would need to know how to do, how to perform kind of sophisticated surgeries using very advanced tools, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the types of things that the boards should certify the doctor to do. If you imagine being a doctor in rural Mongolia, they are probably going to have a very different set of tools to work with, and so those doctors would need a very different set of skills. They may need to know how to put a patient in traction, something that's just not done in the U.S. anymore, and so the kind of certification process that would need to be put in place there would look very different than the one here.
So what's the bias? What is bias?
Well, so the bias would be, so the bias, if we're trying to measure how ready somebody is to be a doctor, the inconsistent meaning about what it means to be a doctor across the two places is gonna really cause problems in trying to use the same measurement in the two locales.
So if I use your definition of bias, students in group 2 are med students in Mongolia, students in group 1 are med students in the US, and students in group 2, so med students in Mongolia will perform worse on the US test for reasons unrelated to and the attribute of interest is them being good doctors?
Yeah, more or less, but I don't feel like I'm totally comfortable with this example, so let me try again. I'll give you something more related to an academic example. The classic kind of problem that we'll talk about later in the US has to do with if you want to measure somebody's ability in mathematics, then whether or not they're a native English speaker probably shouldn't have too much to do with that. And so the amount of kind of mathematical, or the amount of vocabulary content that goes into math items is an object of constant interest. And so if my construct is ability in mathematics, well, what I'm really also measuring is how well do you know the words in the word problem? This is gonna lead to construct bias. Is that a more useful example?
Yeah, that is.
Any other questions? So in some ways, this is like the worst case scenario. I mean, if you've got this wrong, then the ship is kind of just sunk. Yeah?
Sorry, so just to clarify, because I like your analogy with height, right? And the idea with height is the user isn't actually involved at all in the measurement of height, right? Whereas it seems to me that with the psychological constructs, the user is actually involved, right? So even if you have, like, within the US, you've got, are you conservative, are you liberal? If women are socially conditioned or brought up to understand the word liberal differently than men, then like...
Well, no, so you would never ask them, are you conservative or liberal? You would ask a bunch of indicate, yeah.
Sure, but the point is, like, it seems to me that one of the things you're trying to articulate is that the user is involved here in some way, so you want to make sure that your measures and your items are actually they're getting at the construct as the user understands them, and that there's like some alignment between those. Would that be a fair thing to say or not? Really?
Yeah, no. So certainly, yeah. I mean, I'll talk later about kind of cognitive interviews, and so you definitely want to know you want to make sure that the things you care about are actually driving responses and not other factors that are less relevant. Absolutely. Okay, so let's now think about some more mechanical kinds of bias that might arise. So these are both related to methods of measurement. So the first is instrument bias. And this is when irrelevant properties of instruments influence scores differentially across groups.
Isn't that the language?
What's that?
Isn't that the language that you just said about mathematics?
Well, so I guess you could almost any one of these, if you really wanted to kind of classify it. Yeah, but what I would say is the thing about mathematics, it's not entirely clear. Like, why do we care about mathematics? So somebody can go out and say they want to be an engineer, right? The mathematics that they need to know are embedded in practical situations that involve words and the English language, right? So it could be that we do need some amount of English embedded in our construct. And so I think this is really, the problem here is almost always going to be with construct bias that you haven't appropriately identified your construct. I think that really is maybe a better way of thinking about it. So instrument bias is basically just when some form of the measurement process is causing problems. So one example would just be that US school children have been well trained to answer multiple choice items. If you tried to give a multiple choice exam to students that weren't accustomed to that format, they would probably not do as well solely because they weren't accustomed to that item format, right? You're not learning well with students other than they don't know how to answer those kinds of items, at least not as readily. This is very similar. So this is about the instrument, right? How the instrument is composed. This is about how the instrument is administered. You can imagine problems where you have differences in administration across groups. One recent example has been, as the US has started to move from paper and pencil tests in, kind of end-of-year assessment schools to computer assessments, this just caused no ends of problems, right? I'll talk more about specific computer examples later, but one thing that comes up and has been the object of study by testing companies is, how much does the the operating system matter? You know, the monitor that they have, how is that gonna affect things? So all of these kind of little nitpicky details about the way that the individual interacts with the instrument are relevant in getting this right.
Has that been studied as far as like paper and pencil, like to that level of detail, where like type of pencil, type of paper, color of paper, that kind of stuff?
Probably the color of paper, I would think that's something that they probably have put some time and energy into, but probably not much past that.
And so now there's just more variables or more potential variables that might be contributing to administration bias.
Well, it could be. I mean, with all these things though, you know, you're always kind of, there are always costs, right, associated with,
Right.
you know, doing things differently. And so I think, you know, you want to identify the most problematic forms of bias and get rid of those, and then there are remaining sources that seem, you know, so let me give you an example. I don't want to use certain colors of paper, right, if I have children that are colorblind.
Right.
I don't care so much about using certain kinds of paper if certain kids just don't like the color green, right? That's not such a relevant kind of thing for the measurement process, but you know, so identifying the things that we care about and want to eliminate bias on, and the things that are less salient for the measurement process is an important thing. Okay. So how do we actually detect these biases? So ideally you detect them before you actually start administering the instrument at scale. So, you know, a thorough review of the surveys and administration conditions under which the assessment process is going to take place, absolutely essential. Certainly the larger the scale of the measurement process, the you know, more important all of these steps are. A very useful tool that I think you guys have talked a little bit about are think alouds or cognitive interviews. And so I think, you know, this is something that you can think about in a very formal way. It's a specific type of qualitative interview. I just think about it in a much more kind of hands-on way. What you want to know is you want to interact with the user while they're themselves interacting with the instrument and get them to tell you what they're thinking, because what you want to know is that the thinking that you care about is driving the response process. You don't want them distracted by irrelevant features of the items. You don't want them confused about irrelevant features of the assessment. All of those things you want to make sure have been eliminated as possible you know, sources of bias in the measurement process. So the think aloud bit is really crucial. Very cheap, very easy to do. Takes a little
Easy to
effort.
do, right?
Difficult to schedule. Well, if the hardest part of something is scheduling it, it can't be that. So after administration, I mean, this is a much more problematic situation, right? If you haven't identified a source of bias until after the administration, you're kind of you're in trouble. So there's really no surefire fix. You know, one thing you can do, you can look for between group differences in the structure of the data. I don't want to get too into this because it would start getting pretty technical pretty quickly. But what you just, you know, you don't want the measurement process to generate data that has very different structures in different groups, because that suggests that, you know, what you're measuring is not consistent across those groups. Another thing that was mentioned earlier is you can look at relationships with external criteria. This is incredibly useful, but you know, 99 times out of 100, if you already had some good external criteria, you probably wouldn't need to measure in the first place. It's not, I mean, maybe 99 out of 100 is overstating it, but quite frequently you just don't have good external criteria. This is a real problem. So definitely best to get things right beforehand and not try to fix them afterwards. Okay, so the kinds of bias we've talked about up till now are like big picture types of bias that really just make things a mess for the whole measurement process. Now I want to talk about more subtle forms of bias that may just arise in the context of certain items. By an item, I just mean, you know, an indicator or, you know, a single kind of, the smallest kind of, you know, piece of the measurement process that you're going to be interested in. So the vocabulary term for this, for the problem here, is differential item functioning. And basically you identify differential item functioning in the following context: if after controlling for the ability or, you know, basic status of the person on the psychological variable of interest, you're able to identify, so after controlling for the ability level necessary, for the ability believed to be necessary to solve an item, students in one group still tend to do better than students in another group. right? This is clearly a problem because if I go to measure you and my measurement depends upon something other than how tall you are, that's not great, right? And so if your ability to answer a question depends on something systematic that I didn't intend for, that's a problem. Obviously, every item is gonna, there's an idiosyncratic element, but we're worried about systematic things. Is there a question?
So that means that you need to have at least some other way to measure the ability.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so this is tricky. So here's what tends to happen. And this is obviously imperfect, but this is what people tend to do. This didn't come out great, but let me tell you what's going on. We have here a bunch of students took a math test. Some of them were English, or some of them were native English speakers, that's this solid line. Some of them were non-native English speakers, that's this dashed line. And what we did is that there was one item in particular that was concerning. Imagine the test had, 30 items that were just, symbolic manipulation and then one word problem, for example. We take the scores of the students on the symbolic items and basically, match students up on those scores and then compute the percentage of people that got the word problem item right or wrong in each of the groups. And what we observe in this case is that even even controlling for the underlying ability, right, as proxied by the number of symbolic items right you got, there's a difference in the proportion of people that got the item right as a function of their English language learner status. And this is potentially evidence for differential item functioning. So this is the kind of approach one would take to identify it. It's not foolproof, but this is the type of thing that we can at least know to do. Any questions about what's going on here?
Do you not use any form of like ground truth, like taking, I don't know, experts or people that you, because this already relies on.
Oh, so certainly, so like I should have said back here, expert interviews, those kinds of things are great, like having an expert review, have an expert review the survey, that's certainly very helpful.
I was talking about it more in the relation to this graph because it, again, kind of what was confusing all of us, it takes into account that what you're measuring, like the other 19 questions or whatever are correct, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So
So that's kind of the fundamental problem here is that like
there's no ground truth.
Yeah, it's kind of turtles all the way down if you're so, if we don't have faith in any of these items, then yeah, the battle's kind of lost. But in that case, why are we worried about this one, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
If you randomly selected groups of people enough times in any population, eventually you should get to the point where, ideally they'd be the same, right? Just like they're actually randomized and independently drawn. But eventually you get to the point where they'd be different somehow. If the population is big enough and you're drawing enough samples. Is it like, you could break it down to enough groups where you find.
Sure, so you want to account for the fact that there are always going to be differences just due to sampling between between response patterns. So that's certainly something you want to account for. And all the kind of common tests for this type of thing or statistical tests that do exactly that. All right, so I'm going to come back to some specific items where I'll show you diff. I think, in just a few slides. So this is just kind of recaps what was previously said, but the basic strategy here is just to estimate the location on the scale that you've established for your construct, for all the individuals in your study, and then look at some form of regression or just some comparison to identify whether those that got the item, basically to identify whether there are differences in the relationship between the ability that we've measured and the response process for the item across the groups. Right? It's exactly what we did here, and that's the kind of general template that one hopes to use in this situation. So if you do this and you see something like that, you say, lo and behold, I've identified differential item functioning. And certainly in the context of standardized testing, that's a real problem. So now let me give you some specific examples. We'll start to see where things go awry in practice. So this kind of goes all the way back to the beginning of psychological measurement. So some of the first psychological measurement studies were trying to look at IQ. And this is a passage from a recent work by Greg Camilli. He says the first well-known studies of test item functioning began in 1910 with Alfred Binet, who was concerned that some items may disadvantage students from lower socioeconomic strata. Binet eliminated certain kinds of items that were considered too dependent on home training or language, right? So, you know, the idea that kind of irrelevant features of your background may predispose you to be better or worse at answering certain types of items, that's long been a topic of concern for at least 100 years. This is a classic example. So this is the old, you know, they don't do this anymore. These are the old analogy items from the SAT, where the X is to Y as Z is to blank. And the one we have here is decoy is to duck, as A, net is to butterfly, B, web is to spider, C, lure is to fish, lasso is to rope, and finally detour is to shortcut. And so this item was shown to demonstrate diff, and now the question is why?
Maybe you've never hunted.
Yeah, certainly a strong kind of hunting, you know, gradient across this item. And so the diff that was identified was a gender diff, right? So
Women don't know what this is.
what's that?
Is that women don't know what this is about?
Well, so empirically, women were just less likely to get this item right, holding everything else constant.
Right.
Okay, so that's an example of diff related to gender, right? And so this item got yanked from circulation. This is, I think, a very different type of example. Yeah.
And just to clarify, that's because what this question is trying to test is your ability to do analogical reasoning,
Yes, yeah,
not whether you
yep,
know what
exactly,
the term means.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Presumably women and men should both know what the term means.
Yeah. You know, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know exactly why they stopped doing these analogy items. Mike, if I had to wager a guess though, I mean, at the end of the day, these are so vocabulary driven that like it's gonna be hard to get away from this problem.
Right.
You know? So this is a very different type of diff. So this came from a study of life satisfaction that was performed in the US and in China. There was one item in particular that showed substantial diff. If I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing, right? And so controlling for how you respond on the other items, there were big differences in how the US and Chinese respondents responded to this item. And so the researchers started wondering why, and they went out and did some interviews. And what they came up with is the following. I excerpted 2 long pieces. I won't read all of this, but I think this is fascinating. In the present context, the positive evaluation of their own past accomplishments seems more self-enhancing than the positive evaluation of external living conditions. One of the reasons why generally satisfied Chinese participants did not endorse items 4 and 5 might be that the endorsement of these 2 items seems to be too self-enhancing and not socially desirable, right? So, you know, they're basically saying that social cues are gonna, you know, lead you to answer items differently, and in this case, there might be some evidence that that was driving the behavior of the Chinese respondents. Another thing that they threw out is that the entire construct loaded on this item in a different way. Essentially, they were saying that the Chinese concept of life satisfaction is based primarily on external conditions and the current status rather than past accomplishments, right? So if you care about how things are in the here and now, it's not going to be so relative or so relevant to you if you would change something or not in the past. That's not going to be a good indicator of how satisfied you are with life at the moment, right? And so we have here an item with diff. And, you know, the tricky thing now is what do we do with it? I mean, I think, you know, what we've learned here is really, we've kind of we've honed in on what it is we want to measure, right? So now, you know, if you were the researcher conducting the study and building this survey, you'd have to ask yourself, is this indicator like really something I care about, or is it just generating noise?
So, feel free to pump this question if it's not relevant here, right? But I could see 2 ways of going about this. Like if this happened to me, right? So one way is I create an adaptive survey where maybe I find a better item for each population to get at the same construct. Or the other way is I try to start a research endeavor to come up with like a cultural agnostic research like an item. Is that kind of like 2 ways that you
You have to say the second one again. The first one is kind of dangerous. Like anytime you start to vary the measurement process across context, there's a classic adage in measurement. It's about measuring change over time, and the adage goes, If you wanna measure change, then don't change the measure, right? And this is the same kind of thing, you know, the one thing we really can hold constant is the measure, and if we start to allow that to vary across context, then all bets are off. What was the second suggestion?
I mean, the second suggestion is you try to devise a culturally agnostic item.
Well, but, I mean, so, yeah, that, I have no problems with that. I mean, you know, the issue here is how kind of culturally agnostic is the whole idea of being satisfied with your life, right? Like, this is entirely bound, but.
Which is my point,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, here it seems to me like I mean, you either have to check it or you have to go with the first approach, or you have to like live with the fact that you haven't.
I mean, I think,
Right.
you know, like, I mean, you know, in some ways it's like, why do they care about measuring this variable? You know, this is not something you're gonna credential somebody on, right? Like, it's not like a high stakes assessment. And so what this, you know, what we've learned here is we've learned about the construct, which is kind of the goal in the long run, right? And so I think this is an example where diff is less a problem and more a source of information about the world.
Right, I guess I was thinking that what if you really care about it and you really want to measure
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, there's just no surefire, you know. So this now is a language example. This is an item. Basically, there's this little spinner, and the item says, to win a game, Tamika must spin an even number on a spinner identical to the one shown below. If you can't see these numbers, it's 1, 3, 4, 6. And then it says, are Tamika's choices of spinning an even number certain, likely, unlikely, or impossible, right? Obviously, this is an attempt to measure something about what the student knows about probabilities. And I really love this. What the researcher did is basically they through some kind of cognitive interview with the child, they constructed the item as it read to the student based on their competency in English. And so that student, given their level of English, was trying to answer the item based on this, right? So to blank a game, Tamika must blank a blank number on a blank, blank, blank to the one blank, blank.
What?
Right? So this is an example of response being driven not at all by the student's knowledge of mathematics and completely by the student's knowledge of English. And so this is a nice example of language in diff. If you're interested in this at all, this is just a little advertisement. So Willie Solano Flores is a new professor at the GSE, and this is his area of expertise. So he would know way more about this than I do. Okay, so this, I actually think this is really fun. I think it's important to at least know, in the context of the original question, are standardized tests fair? It's at least the case that, in the last couple of decades, standardized tests at this point tend to use items that show basically no diff. That is, one thing that the testing companies work incredibly hard to do. And so this is an analysis based on the SAT verbal section from 94-99. This is actually quite old. These are students from UC Berkeley, and this is a diff analysis of white versus African American students. What you have here on the y-axis are diff estimates. I don't want to talk about the x-axis, but if you look at these and just think about the distribution of these things, there's no strong pattern here, right? This is 0, and things are generally clustered about 0. You have kind of as many items showing, also these are very small numbers in the relative scale. You have about as many items showing slight advantages to African American students as to white students. At least from this perspective, you can't, it's hard to make a case that at the item level there's a huge diff problem driving SAT scores.
The diff analysis is only done on groups that are well defined, right? Like they just check like ethnicity and gender, but there could potentially be a lot of other clusters. Like they don't just check clustering of answers. They just check it for like there's no diff for this, but not for gender, right?
What's that?
So
So
here-
they would do it for, so they're gonna do it primarily for, kind of race,
and gender.
sex, language status, and then.
Social economic status.
What's that?
Social economic.
Probably not. It would depend upon, it depends, but not as a general rule. So I think you have to make some argument about, if that's not being, driven by. See, I think it gets very hard,
Like you can think about education system, okay? Like, not for every, like, at least, where I come from, there's a very difference between a religious education system, like, it's a different system of education system. So you can think that it can have a really strong bias on which education system you came from, if you're homeschooled, if you're whatever,
Sure,
like,
sure.
you can think about a lot of different groups, like, subgroups that are not tested at all. So saying this is just saying that there's a minimal diff in these specific things.
You're absolutely right about that.
Okay.
That's true. Oh, the last group I was gonna mention, but it gets complicated, is, they're, special education students, whether items show diff with them, it leads to the whole kind of concept of, accommodations and alternative assessments. That becomes a tricky subject, but that's at least another area people are very attentive to. All right, so, any other questions about this? Oh yeah, so I think this is fascinating. This is just one of these things that, if you had asked me, I just would never have known what to guess. Basically, it has been realized that for both reading and math tests, multiple choice items generally favor males, while constructed response items generally favor females. Content analyses showed that flagging, that's not so relevant. So yeah, so this gender bias across multiple choice versus constructed response items is, I don't know where that comes from, but I find it very provocative.
Is that found to be stable cross-culturally?
No, this is very U.S. specific. It might be, but I have no knowledge of it. It's pretty well
That
replicated
might
in
be
the
a way to
US.
get at what aspect it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
It also specifically says it's grades 4 through 7.
Oh, goodness.
So I don't know how general, I think.
Yeah, it's grades 4, 7,
how-
and 10.
How generalizable this is to college level learners, or is there just some?
Yeah, and so one of Sean Reardon's students is looking at how the relative composition of state assessments in terms of multiple choice and constructive response items, whether that might be driving observed gender differences in performance. So it's pretty well replicated in the U.S., but whether it extends beyond that, I just don't know. So we'll come back to this in a moment. This is another type of method bias, and basically, here we actually get something good. So in this study, they were basically able to show that it didn't really much matter whether the examinee took the assessment via pencil and paper or on the computer, right? So at least in this one case, it didn't. That's certainly not generalizable, but it's the type of thing that you want to ask and answer rather than just hope and pray that it doesn't matter. This one I really love. So there were two forms of an email survey, whether the survey was first embedded in the email and then attached to the email, where the respondent had to go and click it open. I just thought that was fascinating. It never occurred to me to study that as a source of bias, but I think not surprisingly they showed that nobody wants to open an attachment. that one you probably could expect beforehand. So this is another example of kind of cultural bias. Not bias exactly, but where culture is driving response tendencies. And basically, there's this idea of extreme responses. So this is especially commonplace in Likert scales. So Likert scales are strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And some people tend to respond at the extremes. And as it turns out, there are some cultures tend to respond in certain more or less extreme manners. And in this study, they basically observed some kind of slight trend between how extreme the responses were on the survey at the level of the nation and the amount of individualism that had been measured in the level of the nation, right? So this is something potentially, this is something that, you could utilize perhaps if in the design of your surveys.
Do you want to just say just a little quick for people who may not be familiar with item response theory, just a quick definition of what item response theory is?
Oh yeah, sure. So item response theory is the kind of statistical theory that's used to study how people respond to items, right? So it's the statistical machinery that goes into constructing test score scales, for example. It's especially useful when you want to kind of, in the SAT, right, they give that thing every couple of months, but they want those scores to be constant across time, or at least comparable across time. And And so doing that is the kind of thing that I response theory achieves. Okay, and so we're getting pretty near the end here. So the last kind of hint for thinking about measurement and variance, this goes back to a suggestion at the beginning, is looking for external criteria. So this is a study of what these gentlemen call the predictive validity of the graduate management admissions test scores, the GMAT. And basically what they do is they take the GMAT, they take the quantitative and the verbal section, and they also get the undergraduate GPA for respondents, and they use all these things to predict GPA for first-year management students. And essentially they're able to show that the thing looks pretty good, that across all comparisons, no statistically significant differences were found, which supports the hypothesis of no differential prediction across majority-minority groups. So they're saying here that you're not seeing kind of different patterns of predictive power of the GRE across racial groups. So it's not the case that the GRE is more or less predictive of GPA in your first-year management sequences for white students versus African-American students.
Is it predictive at all?
Yeah. So it predicts, so it predicts, about 20%. So combine these things predict about 20% of the variation in GPA in management coursework. Yeah, so that would be, if it didn't predict at all, that would be a whole nother kind of concern. Any other questions about this? So when you have an external criteria, you obviously are going to want to think about how that, what that tells you about your measurement process. And this is also an example of looking for different kinds of structure in your data across group, right? Like if you had a very different kind of predictive structure in the Asian American students versus the Hispanic students, that might clue you into some kind of something that was not invariant in the measurement process across those groups. Okay, so final thoughts for me, and then maybe, I don't know how much time we have, but we can just have a conversation. But this is a very deep area, and as a general rule, I think if you try to really think seriously about psychological measurement as measurement, you'll have good intuition about what's important and what you need to care about. And fundamentally, if you have diff or other forms of irrelevant variance influencing your measurements, you really don't know what you're measuring. That's kind of the fundamental problem. And so we'll talk about this. How is this going to influence assessment choice for your modules? But here's my email if you ever want to talk more about this stuff. Feel free.
So, and I'd like to spend some time talking about that.